The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of gray November day that made Boston feel like the end of the world. I stood in my apartment hallway, staring at the Vermont return address while my landlord's latest eviction warning sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Uncle Raymond was dead, and he'd left me as mortuary. I read the letter 3 times, looking for the punchline. Raymond Miles, my father's older brother, was a man I'd met exactly twice in my life. Once at my parents' funeral when I was 12, and again at my high school graduation where he'd given me a card with $50 and some advice about saving for retirement. That was 24 years ago. Now he was gone, and apparently I owned a funeral home in Vermont. I tossed the letter onto my cluttered coffee table and went to the fridge. The beer was cheap, but it was cold. I took a long pull and tried to make sense of this. The timing was either cosmic irony or dumb luck. 3 months post-divorce, my ex-wife had the house, half my retirement, and a new boyfriend with a boat. Meanwhile, I had an apartment I couldn't afford, credit card debt that kept me up at night, and a teaching job at a community college that barely covered groceries. And now, a mortuary. I called the lawyer the next morning. A man named Thompson confirmed everything. The business was mine, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. Just a building, the equipment inside, and whatever business Raymond had built over the years. Did he say why? I asked. Why me? Mr. Miles didn't offer explanations, Thompson said. Just instructions. 2 days later, I packed everything I owned into my 10-year-old Subaru. It didn't take long. The divorce had left me with clothes, books, and a collection of kitchen gadgets I never used. I turned in my apartment keys, told the college I wouldn't be back for spring semester, and headed north. The drive to Vermont took 6 hours, mostly because of the snow that started falling around the Massachusetts border. By the time I reached the town of Blackwood Falls, the roads were slick and my windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle. The mortuary sat at the edge of town, a 3-story Victorian with dark green trim and a sign that simply read, Miles Family Mortuary in gold lettering. Despite being at least 100 years old, the place looked immaculate. Fresh paint, clean windows, not a shingle out of place. I parked in the small lot beside the building and just stared at it for a while, snow collecting on my windshield. This was mine now. All mine. Thompson met me at the front door, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd been born in a suit. He handed me a thick envelope and a ring of keys without much ceremony. The master key opens all exterior doors, he said, pointing to a brass key that looked older than I was. The blue key is for the basement. The rest are labeled. Did you know my uncle well? I asked. Thompson's expression didn't change. I handled his legal affairs for 20 years. Your uncle was a private man. He left me standing in the foyer, surrounded by dark wood paneling and the faint smell of furniture polish and something else I couldn't quite place. Something chemical. The first floor was all business, viewing rooms, a small chapel, and an office with a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. The second floor had living quarters, a kitchen, living room, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom that had been updated sometime in the last decade. Everything was clean, but dated, like stepping into the 1980s. I brought in my bags and made a half-hearted attempt at unpacking before curiosity got the better of me. The blue key opened a heavy door off the kitchen that led to a narrow staircase. The basement lights were operated by an old-fashioned switch that made a satisfying click when I flipped it. The preparation room was larger than I expected, with stainless steel tables, sinks, and equipment I couldn't name. Beyond that was a storage area with what looked like filing cabinets, but were actually body drawers built into the wall. There were at least 30 of them, each with a small label holder. What caught my attention, though, was another door at the far end of the room. It was made of heavy metal with a serious-looking lock. The blue key opened this too, revealing a tunnel carved directly into rock. Light switches along the wall illuminated a path that extended maybe 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees as I walked through. The cave was about the size of a small warehouse, with natural limestone formations creating eerie shadows. But what made me stop in my tracks were the bodies. There were perhaps a dozen of them, laid out on stone slabs. They didn't look dead, not in the traditional sense. They looked preserved, mummified, but not in the dried, withered way of Egyptian mummies. These bodies looked almost lifelike, as if they might sit up at any moment. I backed out quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. I locked the door behind me and headed back upstairs, trying to process what I'd seen. In Raymond's office, I found a leather-bound ledger in the desk drawer. Inside were meticulous records, names, dates, and payments. Lots of payments. Most entries showed standard funeral costs, but some had additional notations. Pharmaceutical preservation study, followed by payments of $50,000 per body. $50,000 per body. The company name appeared repeatedly. Crenshaw Neurological Research. Next to it, a name, Dr. Sarah Crenshaw. I dug deeper into the desk and found a folder with detailed notes about the cave system beneath the mortuary. Raymond had documented the unusual preservation properties of the limestone caverns, something about the mineral content and constant temperature creating natural mummification. His notes were scientific and precise, explaining how bodies stored in the caves maintained tissue integrity far longer than conventional methods allowed. It was well past midnight when I finally stopped reading. My head was swimming with information I didn't fully understand. I made myself a sandwich from the groceries I'd picked up on the way into town and took it upstairs to the bedroom I'd claimed as mine. The house creaked and settled around me as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Despite the strangeness of the day, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke sometime later to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. Sitting up in bed, I listened intently. There it was again, a faint whispering sound coming from somewhere below. It was too articulated to be pipes or the wind. It almost sounded like voices. I got up and followed the sound downstairs through the kitchen and to the basement door. With my ear pressed against the wood, the whispers became more distinct, though I still couldn't make out words. They seemed to be coming from the cave. The rational part of my brain said it was just air moving through the cave system, creating sounds that my sleep-addled mind was interpreting as human. The less rational part wondered if I was losing my mind, or if there was something in that cave that defied explanation. I put my hand on the doorknob, then pulled it back. Whatever was down there could wait until morning. I wasn't about to go exploring caves in the middle of the night. Back in bed, I pulled the covers up and tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the unfamiliar sounds of an old house. But as I drifted back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers had sounded like words, like someone trying desperately to tell me something. And I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that settled over me like a shroud, the feeling that Uncle Raymond had left me more than just a mortuary. He'd left me a mystery, one that the whispers in the basement seemed eager for me to solve. I woke up early the next morning, my head still buzzing with questions about what I'd found in the basement. After a quick shower and 2 cups of coffee that did little to clear the fog, I headed to Raymond's office. If I wanted answers, I needed to dig deeper. The office felt different in the morning light, less mysterious, more practical. Dust motes floated in the sunbeams that cut through the blinds. I settled into Raymond's leather chair, which creaked under my weight, and pulled open the bottom drawer where I'd found the ledger last night. "All right, Uncle Raymond," I muttered to the empty room. "What else were you hiding?" Behind the ledger was a row of manila folders, each labeled with a year going back 2 decades. I pulled out the oldest one, dated 20 years ago, and spread the contents across the desk. Inside were letters, actual paper letters with stamps and everything, between Raymond and Dr. Sarah Crenshaw. The earliest correspondence was formal, almost clinical. "Dear Mr. Miles, I'm writing to inquire about your mortuary's preservation techniques. My research into Alzheimer's disease requires exceptionally well-preserved brain tissue samples. I flipped through more letters, watching as the relationship evolved from professional to collaborative. Dr. Crenshaw had been looking for a way to preserve brain tissue that maintained cellular integrity better than standard formaldehyde preservation. Apparently, the natural properties of the limestone caves beneath the mortuary created ideal conditions. The mineral content, combined with the constant temperature and humidity, creates a natural mummification process, I read aloud from one of Raymond's carbon copies. The tissue samples you've provided show remarkable cellular preservation, far superior to conventional methods. By the 5th year of correspondence, they had established a regular arrangement. Crenshaw would send certain bodies to Raymond for special preparation in the cave system. The payment started at $10,000 per specimen, but increased to $50,000 in recent years. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my eyes. On the surface, it seemed legitimate. A researcher paying for specialized preservation services. But something felt off. Why the secrecy? Why hadn't Raymond ever mentioned this lucrative side business to anyone? The next folder contained death certificates, dozens of them, all for patients who had been preserved in the cave. I spread them across the desk, looking for patterns. Most listed heart failure as the cause of death. Many had died during routine appointments at Crenshaw's clinic. That's weird, I muttered, noticing another similarity. Nearly all the certificates contained a note about religious exemptions from autopsy. I counted the forms with this exact phrase. Family has requested immediate preparation without autopsy for religious reasons. The same wording appeared on 43 different certificates. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search on religious prohibitions against autopsies. While some faiths did have concerns about body integrity after death, the consistency of the wording across so many different cases seemed suspicious. These people couldn't all have belonged to the same obscure religion. As I dug deeper into the more recent files, I found medical records attached to some of the death certificates. Many of the deceased were Alzheimer's patients under Crenshaw's care. Their conditions had been stable, or even improving according to the notes, until they suddenly died of heart failure during routine checkups. Jesus, I whispered, a chill running down my spine as the pieces started to fit together. I spent the rest of the day going through every file, every letter, every record Raymond had kept. By the time darkness fell outside the office windows, my stomach was in knots. The evidence wasn't conclusive, but it painted a disturbing picture. Dr. Sarah Crenshaw might have been using her patients as research subjects, and not in the ethical, consent-based way. I made myself a sandwich for dinner, but barely tasted it. My mind kept returning to those bodies in the cave, preserved so perfectly they almost looked alive. Were they victims rather than specimens? Had Raymond known? That night, I tried to sleep, but the whispers from the basement seemed louder than before. I pulled my pillow over my head, trying to block them out, but they seeped through anyway, like water finding cracks in a dam. When I finally did fall asleep, my dreams were vivid and terrifying. I saw medical equipment, syringes, vials, monitors. I was strapped to a table under bright lights, unable to move as a figure approached with a needle. The face above me kept changing. Sometimes it was Crenshaw, sometimes Raymond, sometimes people I'd never seen before. "It won't hurt," the figure said, but I knew it was a lie. I jerked awake at 3:17 in the morning, sweating despite the chill in the room. The faces from my dream lingered in my mind, strangers with frightened eyes and slack expressions. They seemed so real, so specific, like memories rather than dream inventions. The whispers continued downstairs, more insistent now. I tried to ignore them, pulling the blankets over my head like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. But something tugged at me, a compulsion I couldn't explain. "This is crazy. I told myself as I got out of bed and pulled on my robe. You're going down to the basement because of whispers and bad dreams. Yet I found myself walking downstairs anyway, flashlight in hand. The mortuary was silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the persistent whispers that grew louder as I approached the basement door. The blue key felt cold in my hand as I unlocked the door. The preparation room looked eerie in the beam of my flashlight, stainless steel surfaces gleaming, shadows stretching from equipment. I moved past the embalming tables toward the storage drawers built into the wall. The whispers were definitely coming from there. Not from all the drawers, but specific ones. I moved closer, listening. She said it wouldn't hurt, came a faint voice from one drawer. I stepped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. That wasn't my imagination. It was clear, distinct, a man's voice, thin but audible. Another whisper emerged from a different drawer. The needle was wrong. My hand shook as I approached the drawer where the first voice had come from. The label read, John Pierce. According to the records I'd reviewed earlier, John Pierce had been a 67-year-old Alzheimer's patient who died of heart failure during a routine appointment with Dr. Crenshaw 3 months ago. I recognized his face from my dream. What the hell is happening? I whispered, backing away from the drawers. The whispers continued, overlapping now, coming from multiple drawers at once. Some were just unintelligible murmurs, but others formed clear phrases. Not my time. She lied to all of us. Help us. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't possible. Dead people didn't talk, yet the evidence of my own ears was undeniable. Raymond knew. Came another whisper, this one stronger than the others. Raymond tried to stop her. My uncle had discovered something about Crenshaw's research, something bad enough that he'd started collecting evidence, and now he was dead too. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold floor, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ceiling. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture too horrible to fully comprehend. Crenshaw had been killing her patients, likely with insulin overdoses that mimicked heart failure, to harvest their brains for her research. Raymond had figured it out and started gathering evidence. And then Raymond had died unexpectedly, leaving everything to his estranged nephew. He left it all to me because he knew I'd find this, I said to the empty room, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. He wanted me to finish what he started. The whispers seemed to grow more excited at this realization, swirling around me like an invisible current. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to fragments of stories from the dead, trying to make sense of the impossible. By the time dawn light began to filter through the small basement windows, I knew what I had to do. I needed more evidence, concrete proof I could take to the authorities. If Crenshaw had killed all these people, and possibly my uncle too, she needed to be stopped. I climbed to my feet, muscles stiff from sitting on the cold floor all night. The whispers had quieted somewhat, as if satisfied that I understood their message. I'll help you, I promised the silent drawers as I headed back upstairs. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened to you. As I closed the basement door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now part of something much bigger than inheriting a mortuary. I had inherited a responsibility, to the dead, to Raymond, and to whoever might be next on Crenshaw's list. I pulled open the drawer labeled John Pierce first. His face was the one I'd recognized most clearly from my dreams. A kind-looking older man with thinning gray hair and a distinctive birthmark on his right forearm, shaped like a crescent moon. His skin had that strange, preserved quality I'd noticed in the cave bodies, neither decayed nor lifelike, but somewhere in between. As I examined him more carefully, I noticed something odd about his arm. There was a small puncture mark in the crook of his elbow, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I checked his death certificate again, heart failure during a routine appointment. But this mark didn't look like a standard blood draw. It was lower on the arm, and there was a faint bruising pattern around it. I moved to the next drawer where the whispers seemed strongest. Another Alzheimer's patient, a woman in her 70s. Same cause of death, same type of injection mark. I checked drawer after drawer, finding the same pattern repeated in each body. These aren't normal injection sites, I muttered to myself, thinking back to the medical shows I'd watched. Blood draws were typically done in specific veins, but these marks were in locations that would be less noticeable, places where a quick injection could be disguised as something routine. The whispers grew more agitated as I continued my examination. I could almost make out words now. Insulin. She used insulin. I froze. Insulin overdose. It would cause a rapid drop in blood sugar that could trigger heart failure, and it would be nearly impossible to detect unless someone was specifically looking for it. And if these bodies had been preserved in the cave's unusual environment, traces of it might still be present in their tissues. I returned to Raymond's office, my mind racing. If what I suspected was true, Dr. Crenshaw had been systematically killing her patients to harvest their brains for research. And somehow Raymond had figured it out. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces, John Pierce and the others, strapped to tables, needles approaching their arms as Dr. Crenshaw loomed over them. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more specific. In one, I could clearly see a calendar on the wall showing March 15th. In another, I heard Crenshaw saying something about specimen 43 showing remarkable preservation of neural pathways. By morning, I was exhausted and desperate. I tore through Raymond's office, pulling books from shelves, checking behind pictures, tapping walls for hollow spaces. There had to be more evidence somewhere. Raymond was too meticulous to not have documented everything. After hours of searching, I noticed something odd about the wooden paneling behind Raymond's desk. One section didn't quite match the others. The grain pattern was slightly off. I ran my fingers along the edges and felt a small gap. When I pressed on one corner, the panel popped loose. Behind it was a small compartment containing a metal lockbox. The key was taped to the back of the panel. My hands shook as I unlocked it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing close-ups of injection sites on various bodies. Each was labeled with a name and date. There was also a small digital recorder and several USB drives. I plugged the first drive into Raymond's computer. It contained medical records, the original versions, not the altered ones, that had been submitted with the death certificates. According to these records, many of Crenshaw's patients had been showing improvement before their sudden deaths. The second drive held financial records showing payments from Crenshaw to various medical examiners and county officials, bribes to look the other way or sign off on questionable death certificates. With trembling fingers, I pressed play on the digital recorder. Raymond's voice filled the room, deep and methodical as he documented dates, times, and observations. There were recordings of phone calls between him and Crenshaw, discussing specimen preparation and optimal preservation techniques. In the beginning, the conversations were clinical and professional, but as time went on, Raymond's tone changed, becoming more hesitant, more questioning. The final recording was dated just 3 weeks before Raymond's death. "Sarah, we need to talk about John Pierce," Raymond's voice said. "His family is asking questions. They don't believe he died of heart failure." "You know how families can be, Raymond," Crenshaw's voice replied, smooth and unconcerned. "They always want someone to blame. His daughter says he was improving. The new medication was working. Alzheimer's is unpredictable, you know that." "What I know," Raymond said, his voice hardening, "is that I found an insulin injection site on his arm, the same place I've found it on the last 12 bodies you've sent me." There was a long pause before Crenshaw spoke again. Her tone completely changed. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to document everything. The injection sites, the altered medical records, the bribes. I have it all, Sarah." "And what do you plan to do with this documentation?" "That depends on you." This stops now. No more patients dying during routine appointments. No more bodies sent here for your research. Or what? Crenshaw's voice had turned cold. Or everything goes to the state medical board, the police, and the families of every patient you've murdered. The recording ended abruptly after that. I sat back in Raymond's chair, the pieces finally falling into place. Raymond had discovered what Crenshaw was doing and threatened to expose her. And then, 3 weeks later, he was dead. Heart failure during a routine appointment, the same cause of death listed for all of Crenshaw's victims. I felt sick. My uncle hadn't just left me a mortuary. He'd left me evidence of a serial killer, a doctor who had murdered at least 43 patients for her research. And now, I was the only one who knew. The whispers from the basement had grown louder, as if the dead knew I had finally understood. I went back downstairs, drawn by their insistence. This time, instead of examining the bodies, I sat on the cold floor among the storage drawers and closed my eyes. "I know what happened to you," I said quietly. "I know what she did, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." The whispers changed, becoming more distinct, more directed. As I sat there in the dim light of the basement, I began to understand what they were trying to tell me. They weren't just expressing pain or anger. They were trying to help. Raymond hid more. One whisper said clearly, "Blood samples," in the false ceiling of the prep room. "Recordings in the third book from the left, bottom shelf," came another voice. "Hollow inside. Check the garage, under the workbench, metal box." Name after name, location after location. The whispers provided specific details about where Raymond had hidden additional evidence throughout the mortuary. He had been more thorough than I could have imagined, creating a comprehensive case against Crenshaw that no one could ignore. He knew she would come for him, John Pierce's voice whispered. He prepared everything for whoever found it next. For you. I opened my eyes, a new determination filling me. Raymond had trusted me with this, whether he'd known it would be me specifically or not. He'd left a trail of evidence for someone to follow, and that someone was me. I took out my phone and started making notes of every location the whispers had mentioned. Blood samples, recordings, patient files, financial records. It was all here, hidden throughout the building, waiting to be found. "Thank you," I said to the room full of victims. "I'll make this right. I promise." The whispers gradually subsided as I stood up, my list complete. I had work to do, evidence to gather, authorities to contact. Crenshaw had to be stopped before she could claim any more victims. As I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, I glanced at my watch. It was just past 3 in the morning. In a few hours, I would start collecting everything the whispers had told me about, assembling the case Raymond had built. By tomorrow, I would have enough evidence to take to the authorities. For the first time since arriving at the mortuary, I felt a sense of purpose. This was why Raymond had left everything to his estranged nephew. Not because he had no one else, but because he needed someone who would finish what he had started. The whispers led me through the mortuary like a macabre scavenger hunt. I followed their guidance with my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, recording each location as they revealed it. The voices had grown clearer since I'd acknowledged them, as if my acceptance had strengthened their ability to communicate. "The ceiling tiles in the prep room," they murmured, "third from the corner." I dragged a metal stool beneath the spot they indicated and climbed up. The acoustic tile shifted easily, and my fingers found a small metal container taped to the framework above. Inside were 6 vials of blood, each labeled with a patient's name and date. The dates corresponded with entries in Raymond's ledger, all Alzheimer's patients who had died during routine appointments with Dr. Crenshaw. He took samples before embalming, the whispers explained, preserved the evidence. I carefully placed the vials in a padded box I'd found in Raymond's office. My hands trembled slightly as I sealed it. These samples could prove the presence of insulin, the smoking gun that would connect Crenshaw to the murders. The whispers directed me next to the bookshelf in the living room. Third from left, bottom shelf, hollow book. I found it easily, an old medical text with Gray's Anatomy embossed on the spine. The pages had been carefully cut out, creating a cavity that held a small digital recorder different from the one I'd already found. I pressed play, and Raymond's voice filled the room. October 15th. I've confirmed 3 more cases this month alone. Patients showing improvement in cognitive tests, suddenly dead of heart failure during routine appointments. Always when no family is present. Always with the same injection mark pattern. I've started collecting blood samples before embalming. If I can prove insulin overdose. I listened to several more recordings, each more damning than the last. Raymond had been methodically building his case against Crenshaw for months before his own death. The final recording was dated just 2 days before he died. I believe she suspects me. Changed the lock on her office door. Asked strange questions about my embalming process. If anything happens to me, all evidence is hidden throughout the property. The nephew will find it. The nephew. Me. Raymond had planned this, knowing Crenshaw might come for him next. The whispers guided me to the garage, where I found a metal toolbox welded shut except for a small opening just large enough to slip papers through. Inside were copies of patient files, originals that differed from the official medical records. These showed improving test scores and positive treatment responses right up until their sudden deaths. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered everything. Blood samples, recordings, medical records, financial documents showing bribes, and photographs of injection sites. I spread it all across Raymond's desk, organizing it into a coherent narrative that any investigator could follow. The evidence was overwhelming. I picked up my phone and hesitated only briefly before dialing the number for the state medical examiner's office. After navigating an automated system, I was connected to a human. Medical examiner's office, how can I direct your call? I need to speak with the medical examiner, I said. It's regarding multiple suspicious deaths at a neurological clinic. There was a pause. 1 moment, please. After a minute of hold music, a woman's voice came on the line. This is the medical examiner. How can I help you? I took a deep breath. My name is Ethan Miles. I've recently inherited a mortuary in Blackwood Falls from my uncle, Raymond Miles. I've discovered evidence that Dr. Sarah Crenshaw has been murdering Alzheimer's patients for research purposes. I have blood samples, recordings, and documentation. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Mr. Miles, that's an extremely serious accusation, she finally said, her voice measured and professional. What kind of evidence are you referring to? I spent the next 20 minutes detailing everything I'd found. She asked sharp, specific questions that told me she was taking this seriously. I'll send an investigator tomorrow morning, she said when I finished. Can you be available at 9? Yes, I replied. I'll have everything ready. Don't discuss this with anyone else, she warned. If what you're saying is true, Dr. Crenshaw has powerful connections. After ending the call, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Help was coming. The whispers around me seemed to sigh with collective relief. That relief was short-lived. Just after 7 that evening, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Crenshaw Neurological Research. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The whispers around me grew agitated, swirling like invisible currents. After 4 rings, I answered. Miles Mortuary, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Miles, came Dr. Crenshaw's smooth, professional voice. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to touch base about our arrangement. I gripped the phone tighter. Our arrangement? Yes, The one I had with your uncle. I assume Thompson explained it to you. The preservation study? I swallowed hard. He mentioned something about it. Special preservation techniques. Excellent. I have another subject ready for delivery, a research participant who unfortunately passed during treatment yesterday. Would tomorrow evening work for you? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lie, they hissed. Agree. Actually, I said, improvising, I've already received a body today. Just finished the embalming process. But I can certainly prepare space for your delivery tomorrow. There was a pause. A body? I wasn't aware of any scheduled funerals. Just a local resident, I said vaguely. Nothing complicated. I see. Her tone shifted slightly. Well, I'll plan to bring our subject by around 8 tomorrow evening. We can discuss the financial arrangement then as well. Looking forward to it, I lied. After hanging up, I leaned against the wall, my shirt damp with sweat. The whispers surrounded me, urgent and clear. She's testing you, they warned. She suspects. She killed Raymond when he knew too much. Others before him too. I pushed away from the wall. What should I do? I asked aloud. Prepare, came the collective response. Hide the evidence. Set a trap. I worked quickly. First, I made digital copies of all Raymond's recordings and stored them on multiple USB drives. I placed one in my car, one in my jacket pocket, and mailed another to myself at my old address in Boston, knowing it would be returned to sender eventually. Next, I gathered more blood samples from the bodies in the storage drawers, focusing on the most recent victims. I labeled each vial carefully and placed them in a small cooler with ice packs. The whispers guided me to a supply closet where I found a small camera designed to look like a smoke detector. Raymond had purchased it, but never installed it. Following their instructions, I mounted it in the embalming room, positioning it to capture the entire space. I connected it to Raymond's laptop and set it to record continuously, with footage automatically uploading to a cloud storage account I created. Send the link to the investigator, the whispers suggested. I composed an email to the medical examiner with the cloud storage link and instructions to monitor it starting at 8 tomorrow evening. I explained that Dr. Crenshaw would be visiting and that I suspected she might try to eliminate me as she had my uncle. As a final precaution, I hid the most crucial evidence, the original blood samples and Raymond's handwritten notes, in the false ceiling of the embalming room, just as the whispers had advised. It was the last place anyone would look, and even if Crenshaw somehow overpowered me, the evidence would remain for investigators to find. By midnight, everything was ready. The trap was set. The camera was recording. The evidence was secured. All I had to do was survive until the investigator arrived tomorrow. I sat in Raymond's office chair, exhausted, but too wired to sleep. The whispers had quieted to a gentle murmur, like distant conversation. Why me? I asked the empty room. Why did Raymond choose me for this? The whispers stirred. You were always the one, they said. Even when you were young. You heard us at the funeral. Raymond saw it in your eyes. I remembered my parents' funeral, how 12-year-old me had stood beside Uncle Raymond, hearing strange sounds no one else seemed to notice. I'd mentioned it to Raymond, and he'd given me a long, thoughtful look before changing the subject. He knew you would listen, the whispers continued, when the time came. I nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Raymond hadn't chosen me because I was his only living relative. He'd chosen me because he knew I could hear the whispers. I could communicate with those who had been wronged. I could help them find justice. I checked the camera feed one last time, making sure everything was working properly. The embalming room looked peaceful, ordinary. Tomorrow, it would become the stage for a confrontation. I wasn't sure I would survive. But I wasn't alone. I had the whispers. I had Raymond's careful planning. and I had the truth, preserved like the bodies in the basement, waiting to be revealed. I heard Crenshaw's car pull up outside, the crunch of tires on gravel cutting through the evening silence. My heart immediately kicked into overdrive. I moved to the window, carefully peering through the gap in the curtains. The sleek black Mercedes had parked at an angle, its headlights cutting off as the driver's door opened. Dr. Sarah Crenshaw stepped out, her silver bob catching the porch light as she straightened her tailored pantsuit and retrieved a medical bag from the passenger seat. I took a deep breath, mentally reviewing my preparations. The hidden camera was in place, disguised as a smoke detector in the embalming room. The evidence was secured. The medical examiner had been contacted. All I needed to do was get Crenshaw on camera, admitting what she'd done. I moved to the front door, opening it just as she reached the steps. "Dr. Crenshaw," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right on time." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes behind those expensive designer glasses. "Ethan, so good to finally meet Raymond's nephew." She extended her hand, and I forced myself to shake it. Her grip was firm, her skin cool and dry. "I appreciate you continuing our arrangement." "Of course," I said, stepping back to let her in. "The prep room is ready for your subject." Instead of following me toward the embalming room as I'd expected, Crenshaw paused in the foyer, her gaze sweeping over the mortuary's entrance hall. "I'd like to see the whole facility first, if you don't mind. Raymond was always so proud of this place." My stomach tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. "There's not much to see, just the standard viewing rooms, chapel, office." "Humor me," she said, that practiced warmth in her voice making my skin crawl. She touched my arm lightly. "I've been working with your uncle for 20 years. I'd like to see how you're settling in." I nodded stiffly, leading her through the first-floor business rooms. She moved with deliberate steps, examining everything with those sharp green eyes. "How are you finding Blackwood Falls?" she asked as we entered the chapel. "Quiet," I answered, "still getting used to small-town life." She nodded, running her fingers along the back of a pew. "And the mortuary? Any unusual experiences since taking over?" I kept my face neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "Unusual? Old buildings have their quirks," she said with a dismissive wave. "Raymond sometimes mentioned strange sounds. Settling foundations, he called it. The whispers." She was fishing for information about the whispers. "Nothing I've noticed," I lied. "Though I haven't been sleeping well. New place and all." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Trouble sleeping? Any particular reason?" "Just stress," I said. "Inheriting a business I know nothing about." "Any strange dreams?" she asked, her tone casual but her gaze intense. My blood ran cold. How could she know about the dreams, the faces of her victims that had haunted my sleep? "Can't say I remember my dreams much," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity," she replied, touching her jade pendant. "I'm a neurologist, after all. The brain's activity during sleep is fascinating." I needed to get her to the embalming room where the camera was. "Should we head downstairs?" "I've prepared everything as Raymond would have." "In a moment," she said, moving toward Raymond's office. "I'd like to see where my old friend worked." I followed her, increasingly uneasy. She walked straight to Raymond's desk, running her hand over its surface. "Did Raymond leave you much paperwork?" she asked. "Records, files, that sort of thing?" "Just the basics," I said. "Enough to understand the business operations." She opened a drawer without asking permission, peering inside. Raymond was meticulous about his records. I imagine he kept detailed notes about our arrangement. I shrugged. "There's a ledger with payment information. Nothing elaborate." Her eyes met mine, calculating. "Just payments? Nothing else?" "Should there be?" I asked, holding her gaze. She closed the drawer. No, of course not. She smiled again, that empty expression that never reached her eyes. I'd like to see the basement now. This was getting worse by the minute. I needed her in the embalming room, not the basement with the storage drawers and the cave. The embalming room is this way. The basement first, she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. I led her down the stairs, my mind racing. The whispers had warned me she was suspicious. Now I was certain they were right. The basement was cold as always, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the preparation room. Crenshaw walked past the embalming tables, heading straight for the storage drawers built into the wall. She stood there, perfectly still, her head slightly tilted as if listening. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. My heart nearly stopped. "Hear what?" She remained silent for several seconds, then shook her head. Nothing, just the building settling, I suppose. She was listening for the whispers. Somehow she knew about them. "Your uncle became quite eccentric in his final months," she said, turning to face me. "Started making wild accusations, seeing patterns where none existed." "I wouldn't know," I said. "We weren't close." "Yet he left you everything," she observed. "Curious choice for an estranged nephew." I shrugged. I was his only living relative. "Perhaps," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "Or perhaps he thought you shared certain qualities." I needed to get control of this situation. "The embalming room is ready. I assume you have a body to deliver?" "Yes," she said, finally moving away from the drawers. "In the car. But first, let's talk in the preparation room." Relief washed over me as she headed toward the embalming room. Finally, we were moving toward the camera. The room was exactly as I'd left it, stainless steel tables gleaming under the lights, instruments arranged precisely, the disguised camera in place on the ceiling. Crenshaw set her medical bag on one of the tables and began removing latex gloves. "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking about our arrangement." "Oh?" I moved to position myself where the camera would capture both of us. "Raymond and I had a very specific understanding," she continued, pulling on the gloves with practiced efficiency. "He provided a service that was invaluable to my research that will help countless Alzheimer's patients." "I'm sure," I said, watching as she reached back into her bag. "The preservation properties of the cave system beneath this mortuary are unique," she said. "Perfect for maintaining neural tissue integrity." She withdrew something from her bag, keeping it partially concealed in her palm. "But our arrangement required absolute discretion." I tensed, recognizing the shape in her hand. A syringe. "Which is why I was concerned when I received a call from the medical examiner's office today," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous softness, asking about my patients who had died during routine appointments. My stomach dropped. She knew. "I didn't call anyone," I lied, eyes fixed on the syringe. "Don't insult my intelligence," she said, all pretense of warmth vanishing from her voice. "You've been going through Raymond's files. You've been listening to the drawers." I took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The investigator who was supposed to meet you tomorrow morning won't be coming," she said with chilling calmness. "I've already taken care of that problem." She'd killed the investigator. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You're insane," I said, backing toward the door. "I'm practical," she corrected, advancing slowly. "My research will save millions from the horror of Alzheimer's. What are a few dozen lives compared to that?" 43, I said, unable to stop myself. "You killed 43 people." She smiled coldly. 44, counting your uncle, and soon 45. She lunged forward with surprising speed for her size, the syringe aimed at my arm. I dodged, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered to the floor. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," she hissed, circling me. "This research is revolutionary. The pharmaceutical companies are willing to pay billions for research based on murder," I spat back, keeping the embalming table between us. Necessary sacrifice, she countered. Your uncle understood that until he developed a conscience. I needed to keep her talking, keep her on camera. Is that why you killed him? Because he threatened to expose you. He became a liability, she said simply. Just like you. She feinted left, then darted right, nearly catching my arm with the needle. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. It won't hurt, she said, the same words from my nightmares. Just a simple insulin overdose. Heart failure, the death certificate will say. Just like all the others. I was trapped, the door too far to reach before she could catch me. My only hope was the camera capturing everything. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature plummeted, my breath immediately visible in the freezing air. I heard Crenshaw gasp. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice tight with sudden fear. "I'm not doing anything," I said truthfully, feeling the unnatural cold seep into my bones. A strange force seemed to fill the room. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A pressure, a presence that made the hair on my arm stand up. There was a clatter as something, the syringe I assumed, hit the floor. Then Crenshaw cried out, a sound of surprise rather than pain. What is this?" she gasped. "I can't move." My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, moonlight filtering through the small basement windows, providing just enough illumination to make out shapes. Crenshaw was lying flat on the empty embalming slab beside where her latest victim would have been placed, her arms and legs splayed as if pinned by invisible restraints. "Let me go," she shouted, struggling against nothing I could see. I stood frozen, watching in disbelief. I hadn't touched her. I couldn't explain what was happening. Then I saw it. A shadow moving across the wall. Not my shadow, not Crenshaw's. A shadow without a source, sliding deliberately across the concrete wall like a living thing. And in that moment, I realized something else. The whispers that had guided me for days, the voices of Crenshaw's victims that had haunted the mortuary. They had fallen completely silent. The room remained freezing cold, my breath clouding before me as I watched Crenshaw struggle against invisible bonds, her eyes wide with terror as the sourceless shadow moved closer to where she lay pinned. I woke with a gasp, my head throbbing where it had struck the cold concrete floor. The embalming room remained freezing, my breath still visible in the air, but the oppressive presence I'd felt before passing out had dissipated. I pushed myself up on shaky arms, trying to piece together what had happened. I checked my watch. I'd been unconscious for nearly 40 minutes. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way to the window and peered outside. Crenshaw's black Mercedes still sat in the driveway exactly where she'd parked it earlier. That meant she couldn't have left, at least not in her car. I moved cautiously through the preparation room, half expecting Crenshaw to jump out from behind equipment. The syringe she'd threatened me with still lay on the floor where she'd dropped it. I carefully picked it up using a cloth, preserving it as evidence, and placed it in a specimen container from one of the supply cabinets. My coat still hung on the rack in Raymond's office, confirming I hadn't imagined Crenshaw's visit. Everything appeared untouched, the files, the computer, the evidence I'd gathered. But something felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the building. I returned to the embalming room, drawn by a nagging feeling. The metal table where Crenshaw had been pinned stood empty, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights that had somehow come back on. No sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened. Just emptiness and silence. The storage area called to me next. I walked slowly toward the wall of drawers, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. I approached the drawer that had contained John Pierce, the first victim whose whispers I'd heard clearly. My hand trembled slightly as I grasped the handle and pulled. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing John Pierce's preserved body, exactly as I'd seen it before. I closed it gently and moved to check other drawers, confirming that all the victims remained in place. Then I noticed something odd. A drawer I hadn't opened before, one that should have been empty. The label read, Sarah Crenshaw. My heart pounded as I stared at the neat handwriting on the card. Raymond's handwriting, the same as all the other labels. I took a deep breath and pulled the drawer open. Dr. Sarah Crenshaw lay inside, her body perfectly preserved just like the others. Her eyes were frozen wide open in an expression of pure terror, her mouth contorted in what must have been her final scream. She wore the same tailored pantsuit she'd arrived in, her silver bob still immaculately styled. The jade pendant she always wore rested against her throat, but her skin had taken on the same preserved quality as the other bodies in the mortuary. Not quite like traditional embalming, but something else entirely. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This was impossible. I'd been unconscious for less than an hour. No one could have prepared a body this way in such a short time. And who would have done it? I was alone in the building. I forced myself to look closer. There was a small puncture mark in the crook of her elbow, identical to the marks I'd found on all of Crenshaw's victims. The perfect symmetry of justice wasn't lost on me. As I backed away from the drawer, something on the embalming table caught my eye. Something that definitely hadn't been there before. A leather-bound ledger, similar to the one I'd found in Raymond's office, but newer. I approached it cautiously and opened the cover. Inside, in Raymond's distinctive handwriting, was a meticulous record of every victim. Names, dates of death, and actual causes of death were listed in perfect columns. John Pierce, heart failure induced by insulin overdose, administered during a routine appointment. Each entry included details that matched exactly with the evidence I'd gathered. The final entry, dated today, read, Sarah Crenshaw, heart failure induced by insulin overdose, administered as justice. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. This ledger contained everything, a complete confession and record of Crenshaw's crimes, written in my uncle's hand. But I knew with absolute certainty that this ledger hadn't existed before tonight. Raymond had been dead for weeks. This was impossible. Yet here it was, the perfect piece of evidence to tie everything together. I checked the hidden camera I'd installed. The small light indicated it was still recording. I rewound the footage on Raymond's laptop and watched in disbelief. The video showed everything. Crenshaw threatening me with the syringe, the lights going out, and then in the dim emergency lighting, Crenshaw being pinned to the table by nothing visible, the shadow moving across the wall without a source, my collapse to the floor, and then, most incredibly, Crenshaw's body being lifted from the table by invisible hands, carried out of frame. The video showed the room empty for several minutes before the ledger appeared on the table, seemingly materializing out of nowhere. The pages flipped open, and an invisible force appeared to write in it, the pen moving on its own, filling in details in perfect handwriting that matched Raymond's. I watched the footage 3 times, unable to process what I was seeing. The camera had captured everything. Evidence not just of Crenshaw's crimes, but of something beyond rational explanation. I realized the whispers had completely stopped. The mortuary felt different now, peaceful, as if whatever restless presence had been trying to communicate had finally found resolution. The victims had received their justice. Raymond's work was complete. All the evidence I'd collected remained intact. The blood samples, the medical records, the financial documents showing bribes, the recordings of Raymond confronting Crenshaw. And now I had the perfect capstone. Crenshaw's body, with the same injection mark she'd used on her victims, and a ledger detailing every crime. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the state police. My hand was steady now, my voice calm as I identified myself. My name is Ethan Miles. I'm at the Miles Family Mortuary in Blackwood Falls. I need to report multiple homicides and I have evidence of at least 43 murders. I paused, looking at Crenshaw's drawer. Make that 44. And You're going to want to bring the medical examiner. What I have here. You're going to need to see it to believe it." I hung up and sat in Raymond's office chair, waiting. The mortuary remained silent around me, the whispers gone. I glanced at the camera footage again, watching the impossible scene play out on the screen. I knew the authorities would have questions about how Crenshaw ended up in that drawer. I didn't have answers that would satisfy them, or myself. But I had the truth, preserved just like the bodies in the basement, waiting to be discovered. I handed over the evidence to the state police investigators with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The lead investigator, a stern-faced woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, accepted the box containing the blood samples, medical records, and financial documents with latex-gloved hands. "Mr. Miles," she said, her voice professional but not unkind, "we'll need you to walk us through everything again, step by step." For the next 6 hours, I sat in what had been Raymond's office, now transformed into an impromptu interview room. I explained how I'd inherited the mortuary, discovered the bodies, found Raymond's evidence, and finally confronted Crenshaw. When I reached the part about the lights going out and the invisible force, I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "And then?" the investigator prompted. "And then I lost consciousness," I said, deciding to skip ahead. When I came to, Crenshaw was gone. I found her body in one of the storage drawers. The medical examiner arrived shortly after noon. She was exactly as I'd imagined from our phone conversations, practical and no nonsense, with short black hair featuring a distinctive gray streak at the temple. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and she carried herself with the confident efficiency of someone who'd seen it all. "Show me the bodies," she said after brief introductions. I led her and 2 assistants down to the basement. The storage area had been cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, but an officer lifted it to let us through. The medical examiner examined John Pierce first, noting the puncture mark in his arm. "Consistent with insulin injection," she murmured, making notes on a clipboard. "Preservation state is remarkable." She worked methodically through several more victims before, finally, asking to see Crenshaw. When I pulled open that drawer, the medical examiner's professional demeanor cracked just slightly. A sharp intake of breath, a momentary widening of the eyes. "Same injection site," she noted, examining the mark on Crenshaw's arm. "Same preservation quality." She looked up at me. "And you say this happened last night?" I nodded. "Impossible," she said, but her tone suggested she was questioning her own understanding rather than my account. By the 3rd day of the investigation, the medical examiner had confirmed insulin overdoses in tissue samples from all 43 victims. The preservation properties of the cave had maintained the evidence in a way that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. "The mineral content in this environment has essentially mummified the tissues while preserving their cellular structure," she explained during one of our many conversations. "I've never seen anything like it." On the 4th day, I learned that the investigator I was supposed to meet, the one Crenshaw claimed to have killed, was very much alive. He'd been delayed by a snowstorm that closed the roads north of Montpellier. "She was bluffing," he told me when we finally met. "Trying to throw you off balance." The mortuary became a hub of activity as forensic teams worked meticulously, documenting everything. They set up lights in the cave, photographed the stone slabs, took mineral samples from the walls. Scientists from universities arrived to study the unusual preservation properties. Reporters gathered outside, held at bay by police barricades. I stayed in a motel on the edge of town. The whispers that had guided me were gone, and the silence in my head felt both peaceful and strangely empty. I gave statement after statement, signed document after document. Weeks passed. The final count was 43 murders, 42 Alzheimer's patients, and Raymond. Crenshaw's death remained officially unexplained. The video from my hidden camera showed the supernatural events exactly as I'd experienced them, but the official report listed her cause of death as consistent with insulin overdose, manner undetermined. As soon as legally possible, I sold the property to the state for a fraction of its worth. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted distance from the horror that had unfolded there. The sale came with conditions. The bodies would be properly laid to rest, the cave system studied, the victims' families compensated from Crenshaw's considerable estate. Before leaving Vermont, I visited Raymond's grave at the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Blackwood Falls. The day was clear and cold, the kind of winter brightness that hurts your eyes. His headstone was simple gray granite with just his name, dates, and the words, "He sought truth." I stood there with my hands in my pockets, breath fogging in the air. "I understand now," I said aloud, "why you left everything to me. You knew I could hear them. You knew I would finish what you started." The wind rustled through the bare branches of the maple trees surrounding the cemetery. I placed a small stone on top of his headstone, a Jewish tradition I'd learned from a college roommate years ago. It seemed fitting, a marker of remembrance that would outlast flowers. "Thank you," I said, and turned to leave. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror for one last look at the cemetery. For just a moment, I thought I saw a tall figure standing by Raymond's grave, gaunt, white-haired, wearing an old-fashioned three-piece suit. The figure seemed to nod once, then was gone when I blinked. I drove west, then south, then west again. The whispers never returned to haunt me, but sometimes in my dreams, I still saw their faces. John Pierce with his crescent moon birthmark, the others whose names I'd memorized from Raymond's ledger. They never spoke in these dreams, just looked at me with peaceful expressions, as if to say their work was done. I settled in Sedona, Arizona, about as far from Vermont as I could reasonably go. The red rocks and dry heat were the opposite of Blackwood Falls' dense forests and snow-covered hills. I found work teaching at a community college again, but this time with a purpose beyond just paying bills. I taught my students to question, to look deeper, to seek truth even when it seemed impossible. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on my small porch and look up at the stars, so much brighter in the desert sky than they'd ever been in New England. I'd think about Raymond, about the whispers, about how thin the veil between worlds could be. I never tried to hear the dead again. Some gifts, once used, are better left dormant.